Dose, 3 hits orally of Dobie on blotter tabs, 2 hits smoked of cannabis plant material. Smoked products, spice-like smoking blends. Body weight, 180 pounds. I really hoped it would never come to this, but it happened. I got in over my head using psychedelic drugs and ended up in the hospital. What happened was that I thought I would be taking LSD. I know there's barely ever any real LSD around my area, Maryland, so I jumped at the chance. I've taken 12 hits of LSD before and never had a problem, but this time, what I thought was LSD turned out to be a research chemical. My best guess from other reports is that it was DOB. Let this report also reinforce how important set and setting are. Here's a brief summary of my history with drugs: weed, salvia, cocaine, kava kava, morphine, opana, Vicodin, Adderall, inhalants, pure Molly and moon rocks, Ritalin, Ambien, Xanax, Valium, and the biggest category, hallucinogens. Ketamine, DMT, LSD over 200 times, shrooms over 15 times, 2CE, 2CI laced ecstasy, AMT, DIOC, 25I, and my mind goes blank here, even though I know there are more. I considered myself a hardcore psychonaut, and I seldom went to experiences looking to enjoy them, rather to see what I could learn from them and bring back. So I decided to take 3 hits when I got them. The kid who sold them to us claimed he had taken 4 and been fine, although it was a rough ride. I later learned he took 4 after using the stuff for 3 days straight in increasingly large doses. Day 1, he took 1 hit. Day 2, he took 2, and so on, up until 4. What this meant was that his tolerance was as high as it could possibly go, and he still had a hard time. This would have saved me if I had known. But what really led to the hospital was the chaotic entrapment of mind and severe amnesia that led to me fighting my parents and the hospital staff, caused by the power of the blotters I took. As soon as I took the 3 blotters and began sucking on them, my mouth immediately went numb and an overwhelming bitter taste spread across my tongue. As the bitter taste got stronger instead of fading, I knew I was in for more than I bargained for. I turned to my friend and said, "This isn't LSD," and he was like, "Yes, it is." But I knew it wasn't. The bitter taste meant it was most likely DOB, DOI, or ALD. I knew all 3 were substantially stronger than LSD because of my previous experiences with 2CE, 2CI, 25I, and AMT. For me, 1 hit of a DOX usually equals the strength of a 2 to 3 tab LSD trip. I had just taken 3 hits. I can't be sure what exactly it was that I took because I had no way of testing it, but my best guess is DOB. I had never done DOB before, and I had no idea how strong it would be, made even stronger by the fact that I hadn't tripped in months, and my tolerance was as low as it was going to get. The other big problem was set and setting. I was hanging out at my friend's house with the owner and another friend who drove. I'll call the owner R and the driver J. R is a massive hippie with experience in many psychedelics, but I don't like hanging out at his house while I'm tripping because it's very cluttered and gross. Jay is a hilarious pot dealer who I hang out with almost every day. One of the things I really like about Jay is his ability to stay sober while I'm tripping and not piss me off by asking a bunch of questions or making me feel like I'm an animal in a zoo being watched. Fool that I am, I ignored the old saying, "If it's bitter, it's a spitter," and kept the 3 tabs in my mouth. I knew my trip was going to be very strong, but I was sure I could handle it. I was at my friend's house, and when he had to leave and drive me home, my parents wouldn't be home for a few hours. I assumed I'd be able to act normal by the time they got back. I assumed wrong. Holy shit, was I in for a surprise. Within 10 minutes, I was overcome with a massive feeling of lightness in my chest. I thought I was imagining it, but then the corners of my vision began to waver. All I could think was that this must be some sort of joke, that it was coming on within 10 minutes. I repeated to my friend that this was definitely not LSD because by this point I began to see closed-eye visuals. They weren't the organic visuals of LSD, but the geometric, math formula-oriented visuals I had on other DOX chemicals in the past. I didn't mistype, math-oriented visuals. I see geometric shapes, and in the background I see tons of mathematical formulas that literally explain everything. They're usually complex physics formulas. I recognized one as the threshold formula under the field of relativity. I usually can't make out the whole formula, but I see enough to get the idea. Um, the first obvious open eye visuals were posters on the wall. A poster with many different stripes of color appeared to spin like a wheel. I knew I was in for something massive because I could stare directly at the poster and it would still spin. These weren't distortions out of the corner of my eye, they were full on hallucinations within 15 minutes of dropping. Holy fuck. Within 30 minutes, my mental capacity was rapidly expanding in frightening ways. I started to forget how to do everything in ordinary life that I'm used to, and began to perceive language in my head that was built up of pictures and motion. The language was like Mandarin in that the same picture could represent 3 or 4 different words, depending on how the picture moved. Just like one word in Mandarin can mean 4 different things, depending on the tone of voice when spoken. This language evolved into more and more complex meanings. Soon, I felt like I had discovered a completely new language, and at the same time, I understood all the flaws of the English language. I realized that English was way too obsolete and basic to ever convey what was learned from psychedelics. They were showing me their language, which was so much more complex than English. One animated picture that I saw held a complete story. This is very hard to explain due to the fact that this language is not spoken or written in any way. It's conveyed by pictures and images, each holding a wealth of information. I'm just touching on the surface of this idea as it became much more relevant later. It was now about 40 minutes since I had taken the tabs. By this point, the entire room was moving. My friends' faces began to seem like they all had shadows covering them. It was as if I was looking at the room through a light fog. I had never experienced this fog vision before, except during the calming down of a DMT trip, which I would describe as rubber vision. I picked up this collapsible ball that my friend had and tried to calm my racing thoughts by focusing on the ball. But within 30 seconds, I broke it, trying to mold it into an abstract shape. After this, I finally admitted to my friends that I might be in over my head. This was a bad idea because I had much more experience with psychedelics than both of them put together, and they had no idea what to tell me, which only convinced me further that I was in trouble. I still had the situation under control, though. I could still make jokes about my condition, but I started to really feel the dissociation at this point. It felt like I was only powering 50% of my body. I could move my head, but it was really tough to get my brain to send the message to my nerves to move my arms or legs. My speech became very muddled and took on a pitch that was much lower than normal, kind of like I had just inhaled a huge hit of nitrous. This is when things generally started to go downhill. Not to the point where I was worried, but enough to gradually set myself up for a bad trip by ignoring the rules I had established from previous experiences with hallucinogens. One of those rules was to never watch anything on TV that was frightening, depressing, or that provoked too much negative thought and worry about my state of life, like a Michael Moore documentary. But due to my drug use and already heavily altered state of mind, I decided that some reality TV couldn't possibly impact my trip negatively. I pulled out my laptop and decided to watch an episode of Intervention about a woman addicted to heroin. She maintained her habit because her mother, a terrible parent, gave her all the money she needed to buy heroin and even used it with her own daughter. For the first 10 minutes, I was fine, even being a complete asshole, laughing at how stupid the heroin addicts were for getting themselves into that situation and not just quitting. I really kicked myself later for my ignorance. But about 15 minutes into the episode, I started to get very concerned as it grew darker and plunged deeper into the addiction. I realized how easily this could happen to me with my addictive personality and how close I had been to a lifestyle like this at several points. If I hadn't quit some of my earlier habits, I could have been in the one on that show, with my parents being the people I was mocking just 10 minutes earlier. That's when I realized that watching Intervention was a terrible idea, so I shut it off, but the damage was done. My thoughts started spiraling into negative loops, and I knew I needed to go outside and pull myself together. I managed to convince R to go outside and smoke a cigarette with me. Standing up was hard, and opening the door was even harder. By the time I got out of the door, I completely forgot why I had stood up, let alone left the room, and assumed that I was leaving my friend's house. I was completely surprised when he came out after me and lit a cigarette. I lit my own and just stared at the road, not even talking. Outside, the visuals seemed to calm down, but the mental disarray started to build more and more. I had to sit down because I was literally falling over because my visual input felt like it was inconsistent with where my legs should be. I stared straight at the ground and watched as a pattern jumped from stepping stone to stepping stone, moving in an animated way very fluidly across at least 8 different rocks. I told R that I might be over my head. He asked again if I was close to ego death. I stared at him with disgust and confusion, and he realized that I was in no condition to be talking. He told me that he was going inside, and I suddenly realized that he had finished his cigarette. I hadn't taken one puff off of mine, and it had burned all the way to the filter. This is where I began to have minor bouts of memory loss, which would really fuck with my mind and put me in complete states of confusion. It started when I turned around and was completely surprised to find myself at R's house. Even though I had been at his house for hours, my brain was moving so fast and my thoughts were so complex and racing that my mind simply began to stop processing less relevant facts, such as where I actually was in real life. Because of this, my mind started to trick me, and I found my utter loss of the ability to know where I was located unsettling at best. At this point, I had stopped joking around. I walked back into the room where Jay was smoking a blunt and just stated, "This isn't good, gentlemen." I sat back down, and this is the part where I started to lose the ability to talk, just like while on shrooms. My mind was racing so fast that I would start a sentence, forget the next word, and in the second it took me to remember the word, my brain had moved on, and I completely forgot why I had started the sentence, and I would just stop talking and stare. At this point, the only thing I could really say was, "I can't believe how strong this is." The open eye visuals began to become so real that there was no way of telling that they weren't there, except for the fact that I knew it wasn't possible that there were mathematical formulas floating and circling in between my fingers. I'm not joking there. I literally saw 5 or 6 mathematical equations that were floating around and snaking their way through my fingers. These were no ordinary open eye visuals, though, as I moved my hand and looked at it from every angle. The formulas circled my hands and rotated in 3D, never once fading, and they would be there whether I was looking right at my hand or just seeing them barely out of the corner of my eyes. My friends began to look at me like I had lost my mind. They suggested that I take a hit off the blunt to calm myself down. I should have known better. I always use weed to bring up my trips into overdrive. Even worse, the blunt was laced with Scooby Snacks, the synthetic weed, as well. I should have refused to hit the blunt, but in my state of mind, I actually assumed that my friends knew what they were talking about and hit the blunt without questioning it. I took 2 long drags, then realized how much of an idiot I was and quickly passed the blunt away. About 3 minutes later, I started to begin fading away. I would close my eyes, and instead of the normal close eye visuals, my entire consciousness would dissolve away and I would be seeing 360 degrees in my head into this vast desert. There were these huge totem poles rising out of the sand and spinning as if on a wheel, emerging and disappearing from the sand. Each totem pole represented a year of my life. I could see them rapidly emerging, and I saw the quality of the year that was displayed on each pole was directly proportional to the construction of the pole. In hyper high definition detail, I looked at the totem pole with the most flaws in the woodwork, with cracks and pieces chipped out of the wood. I realized that this was the year that I was addicted to Duster and Adderall. I crashed my car and realized that I would have to leave my college due to issues of not yet being mature enough to handle being on my own. I have since resolved these issues and am back in college, but seeing this all before me in this completely real situation brought back bad memories. I then realized that I was not aware of anything in the real world anymore when I closed my eyes. There was only this endless desert. The realization of how deep I was in the rabbit hole hit me like a ton of bricks, and I opened my eyes and I was back in the room, completely shaken. It took me about 30 seconds to realize that I was at my friend's house and I had been lying on the ground, completely cut off from everything. I realized this had never happened before, where I would close my eyes and suddenly lose all touch with reality and literally fade away from where I was to a different plane of existence. I wonder if this place was what convinced Heaven's Gate that there was another level of existence that could be reached, but you couldn't reach it in your human form? Haha, as if. But in all seriousness, back to my dilemma. Jay began to tell me that he was leaving soon, and since he was my ride, I would be leaving also. I began to get very worried at this point because I knew I hadn't even peaked yet, let alone been tripping for more than an hour, and I was going home where my parents would be in an hour or two when I was tripping harder than I ever had off of 9 grams of mushrooms and 12 tabs of LSD. By now, I had started to repeat the phrase, "I can't see anything." This greatly confused my friends, but I really could barely see. It wasn't like my vision was going dark. There were so many visuals, and my vision was strobing so fast that I couldn't see a foot in front of me through the maze of exploding colors. Jay told me it was time to go home, and he was going to drop me off at my house. At this point, I would normally have him drop me off at a local park and pick me up later and take me home, but it was thundering and pouring down rain, and that was out of the question. I should just have refused to leave R's house. That was the only thing that would have saved me looking back. At the time, though, I was so out of it, I thought I could get away with it by just locking myself in my room and not making any noise, and my parents would think I was doing homework. I should have realized that there was no way to avoid talking to them eventually. I left R's house for real this time and walked with Jay to his car. On the way, I told him how hard I was tripping. The gravity of the situation that I was in and the utter mental confusion and turmoil was very intimidating. The ride did nothing to calm my nerves. It felt like my friend was breaking every law, alerting everyone that we had drugs, almost like some sort of sick joke to scare me. In reality, he was doing nothing wrong and driving great. He even managed to make me laugh for the first time in hours by rolling down all the windows, rocking the car, and screaming like he lost his mind. I laughed because it was such a preposterous sight, and it temporarily shifted the chaos of my thoughts to something different. I was so out of it by the time that I was almost home. It felt like I was floating away. I didn't recognize my house, and I looked Jay and asked him why we had stopped driving. He didn't say anything, and then I realized I hadn't actually spoken out loud. I knew that I was indeed heading for an ego loss because each second that passed, the fight to stay on this planet became harder. Every second, I forgot more and more of my normal life. I started to get very concerned that I would just disappear, get lost among the raging and chaotic void that had consumed my mind and simply not exist anymore. The feeling that I am trying to convey is very obscure, but it is a very sobering feeling. This is the feeling that makes people want to fight the psychedelic experience when it starts because it feels like if you don't do anything, you will just fade away. For those who are still with me, I know I am long winded, but I try to elaborate as much as I can because I know there are people out there like me who want to read reports that are detailed about the trip. Anyway, I'm reaching the climax of the trip. When I got to my house, the worst case scenario happened. I discovered that I was locked out of my house in a thunderstorm with both of my parents at least an hour away. I sat in the car with my friend and tried to think of a way out of the situation, but the only thing that I realized I could do was call my dad. I wanted to give the phone to my friend to call him, but realized that was not an option because my dad would know in a second something was wrong if I couldn't talk to him. I felt like I was Custer during his last stand as I dialed the number. I knew that it would take a superhuman effort to talk to him without going off on some ridiculous tangent or just forgetting how to talk while he asked me what the hell was going on. I knew that as soon as he was suspicious, it was over because would in no way be able to explain myself in my condition. It was really a horrible situation knowing that I would probably give myself away calling him, but had no choice. I called him. I summoned every sober cell in my body and focused on simple sentences, straight to the point. He answered, and I started off the conversation pretty well. He told me to check the basement door as it might not be locked. I kept him on the line as I walked to the basement. Luckily, the basement door was unlocked. I told my dad that I was inside, but failed miserably in saying goodbye and thanking him for the help. I couldn't put together a sentence to end the conversation and ended up saying a mix of broken statements, questions about the weather, and how I wouldn't have been locked out in the first place if he had installed upgraded keyless locks. Then I just hung up. Smooth. My last clear memory was entering my room and lighting up a cigarette as I pulled out my laptop. I wanted to attempt to write a trip report for Erowid while I was peaking, but I failed completely, as the English language lacked the words I needed. This is what I managed to type. Think about how funny it is right now for every being in this universe is limited to what you make of it. Just sit here every day, take it all in, don't disrupt life in any way. At this point, it becomes unclear and the text devolves into incoherent letters and numbers. What I was attempting to do was write about how pathetic free will was from the point of view of a god or creator as he watched his subjects obey, but clearly I lost it after the first few sentences. I entered a part of the trip where I was so cut off from my body, I had no idea what was real and what wasn't anymore. My memory started to experience huge gaps, leading to me going to the hospital. The gaps made me convinced that I had never left the place I last remembered being in. This convinced me that anything I saw past that point wasn't real, and I was still in my bed imagining it all. This started while I was lying on my bed typing. The next thing I knew, my laptop was gone, and I was lying under the covers of my bed. In reality, I had thrown my laptop across the room and crawled under the covers, but I didn't remember anything. My memory just skipped to the next point in time. From this point on, everything that I did in real life didn't even occur to me because I wasn't there. I was completely inside my mind and had no awareness of my body. Everything I saw after this point was interpreted by my brain as a creation of my mind. For me, the only thing I could see were four pictures, each representing 25% of reality. These pictures broke apart, and I was only able to view one at a time in rapid succession. I knew I would never be able to go back to my normal reality unless I could mentally fit all of these four pictures back together in a linear sequence. Each picture was animated differently, and I would play them one after another in my mind in an attempt to make them overlap. I started to count out loud from 1 to 4. Each number represented one of the four animated pictures. 1 was green blocks moving upward, 2 was a yellow spinning triangle, 3 was dark blue bubbles stretching, and 4 was a red flowing sea. I went through this phase for what seemed like hours with no awareness of where I was or what I was doing. I knew that if I stopped playing this sequence or forgot a small detail, it would be the end of me. Eventually, I couldn't count past 3 before forgetting what I was doing and having to start again. Soon I couldn't count past 2. I knew that I had failed to correct the rift and would never go back to my life. I imagined a scenario where I changed the past and altered the present. My parents' lives would go on, never knowing they had a son. I would disappear from all pictures, and my room would become a guest room. This was terrifying. In real life, however, my mom had come home. In my desperate quest to count from 1 to 4, I had removed all my clothes, lit several cigarettes, and was rolling back and forth on my bed, holding my head and screaming. I had knocked over my bookshelf and dresser, thrown my laptop, and as she walked in, I was in the process of putting a cigarette out into the wall. This would have been a horrifying sight for anyone to walk into. My mom immediately began trying to find out what I had taken and called my dad to come home right away. But you won't believe how I perceived this experience. In my state, I didn't remember my mom coming into the room. I became aware of a presence that looked like my mom, but since I didn't recall her entering, I was convinced it was some sick trick played on me by my mind, and she wasn't really there. I thought I was still on my bed, typing on my laptop. It's amazing how small gaps in visual input can convince you that nothing is real. In my mind, she was an entity created by the drug to make me give up the fight to bring myself back. I truly believe the drug was using my mom as a ploy to get me to surrender because it knew I would be more likely to give in if it used someone I knew in real life. She repeatedly asked what I had taken, screamed my name, and asked what I had done to myself. This is where it gets even more surreal. My mind was receiving such limited visual input that I saw complete loops of action repeating over and over. My mom would come into the room, ask what I had taken, open my drawers, scream my name, and then leave the room crying. Then she would come in again exactly like the first time, angry and asking what I had taken, open all my drawers, scream my name some more, and then leave again. This same scene kept repeating in my head exactly as it had before, which made me realize with absolute clarity that what I was experiencing could not be real and had to be a creation of the drug. I then started to realize that to escape this mental torment, I needed to disrupt the loop of my mom coming into the room, yelling at me, searching my drawers, and leaving crying. This seemed like the only logical course of action. So, the next time my mom came in and asked what I had taken, I answered, enough to get where I needed. I was convinced that if I could keep answering her questions, I could trip her up and prove that what was happening was not real, thereby breaking free and ending up back on my bed with my laptop. In reality, this led to a completely insane exchange of dialogue that my mom relayed to me later. I'll try to remember some parts. Mom, what did you take? Me, would it really make a difference even if you knew? Come on. What is the matter with you? Me, matter defines anything with mass and volume in a three-dimensional space. There is no matter where I am right now. You know that tone of voice you just used was the same as the fifth time you came into my room. I need to know what you're on. I'm on the second floor of a structure known as a house. What did you take? I didn't take anything. The only thing that was taken was my sanity, livelihood, and it appears my clothes. Mom screams my name again and pleads for me to stop. You're not even real. I'm sitting in my bed. This is fun, isn't it? Any more questions? Oh my God. This literally went on for what felt like a good 20 minutes. I was completely out of my mind, but what I was doing seemed to make perfect sense. I was answering her questions with logic and questioning her since I knew she wasn't real. I scared the living daylights out of my mom. I feel really bad that she had to see me like that. I wish I had stayed at my friend's house. It was probably around 3 hours after I dozed initially. At this point, my mom had called my dad, and he was on his way home. My mom had given up trying to handle me in this state and had gone to her room to wait for my dad. I have virtually no memory of this part. The only thing I remember is a surprisingly sober moment where I walked down to my basement, got a water from the refrigerator, and then sat down at my keyboard and played Moonlight Sonata. My next memory is being back on my bed, which further confirmed my belief that nothing was real, with my dad's voice now yelling at me, saying the exact same things my mom did, but without all the crying and emotional distress. He had much experience with psychedelics when he was younger and knew his stuff. I didn't see him at all while I was in the room, which led to the next catastrophe. The next thing I know, I'm in the back of my mom's car and we're driving. I have no idea where we are. I don't recognize the roads I drive on every day. More importantly, I don't remember leaving my room, which once again reinforced my indisputable logic that this wasn't real, that I was imagining it. I realize I can't move and discover that my dad is holding both my arms very tightly. Since I never saw him in my room, I'm instantly fooled into another insane thought loop of self-deception. This one, however, was much worse. It went something like this. Holy fucking shit! Another goddamn trick! Now the drug is taking the form of my dad. Since I was driving on an endless looped highway in my mind, I realized that the stakes had been raised since I failed to break out of the thought loop when the drug was impersonating my mom. Now, I was on the road that would lead to the end of me. I had to get out of this car. Right now. We were driving down the highway at 80 miles per hour, and I suddenly started trying to push my dad off of me, open the door, and jump out. He grabbed me around the neck to stop me from getting the door open. I elbowed him, but he got his arm around me and held on, really trying desperately not to hurt me. In my state of mind, being grabbed and physically restrained was like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. I started screaming and fighting for my life. I was kicking and squirming, trying to get some leverage so I could escape his grip and get out of the car, hoping to end up back in my room. I kicked my dad away and started pounding on the window, determined to break it and fling myself out. My dad grabbed me again and put me in a wrestling armbar, pressing the side of his arm into my face and nose. The pain was almost unbearable. Due to how much I was struggling, there was literally nothing else my dad could do. I'm 19 years old, as tall as he is, and he taught me how to wrestle years ago. I realized I couldn't beat him and decided to use deception to escape, just like the drug was using against me. I became very calm, turned to my dad, and told him I was sorry, acting like I was completely calm. He gradually loosened his grip and then just held my hand. After a few minutes, he let go of me. I waited about 30 seconds, then lunged for the door. I got it open this time and was about to jump out when he grabbed me by the neck and pulled me back into the car. I tried this stunt at least 3 times before giving up. Another reason it didn't occur to me that what was happening might actually be real was my complete lack of physical sensation. When my dad would grab me, it would hurt for a second, but then quickly fade with no marks or bruises on my arm. There were actually bruises, but I was too messed up to see them. This seemed impossible to me, which cemented my belief that everything was fake and I was still in my room. The next thing I know, I'm sitting in the waiting room of a hospital. I knew I was in a hospital, but was under the impression that I was still in my room and peeking. I thought this was the final test the drug was throwing at me. Here's how I saw the scenario. I was sitting in the hospital, waiting to be led to the morgue. My dad was sitting next to me, looking so defeated and sad. In reality, he was completely exhausted from fighting me for an hour and disappointed in the situation, as well as scared for my well-being. I thought the drug was showing me my death and my dad's sadness resulting from losing his son. I couldn't let myself be taken any further into this hospital. It would be the end of me. I stood up and attempted to walk out of the waiting room. My dad jumped up and grabbed me. Security ran over just as my dad got me under control. They walked away as my dad sat me down and returned to where they had originally been standing. Um, this seemed so absurd, like a predetermined sequence with no negative repercussions. Everyone knew what I was on. My dad had told them I took acid and claimed he had it under control, so security returned. In my mind, this wasn't possible. I thought I would have been arrested and restrained, so I tried to run out again. The result was the same. I knew I had to be clever. I said I needed to use the bathroom, but my dad insisted on coming with me. I went in for a few seconds, looking for a vent or anything to climb through, but found nothing. I tried to run out the door, but was caught. I told my dad I just needed to go out to my car in the parking lot because I thought if I could get outside, I'd be back home. My dad just shook his head. I knew I had failed to escape and was running out of tries. My dad shook his head because I was claiming that I drove here by myself, which was absurd, but I needed a split second to make my escape. I tried several more methods to get out, including pretending to get a pamphlet on depression and slipping out the door, but was stopped by security. Eventually, my dad told me straight up that the police would get involved if I didn't calm down. This stopped me in my tracks because it didn't make any sense. It was the first time I heard him say something different. I was starting to come down slightly. I stopped fighting quickly after that because I knew, no matter what was going on, that police were bad. I calmed down and sat there waiting to see what would happen next. My name was called, and my dad led me back to the first room where they take your information, insurance, and give you a wristband with your details. I cooperated for a while, but when they told me I would be staying the night, I panicked again and was a total pain. I removed the blood pressure gauge from my arm and claimed I just wanted to run outside to my car for a second. They refused, and the nurse called security, who told me again that the police would be involved if I didn't stop. Their serious tone of voice sent me into one of the scariest moments of the ordeal. It suddenly dawned on me why I was in the hospital and why there were huge gaps in my memory, with the last clear memory being me in my room. I must have gotten in my car, driven away from my house, and surely caused an accident where people died. That explained the gaps in my memory and how I went from my room to the hospital. I had killed people. In my drug-induced negligence, I had gotten behind the wheel, and because of that, I had killed someone. This realization hit me so hard that I almost fell over from a panic attack. I knew I had done this, And all these scattered memories from the past few hours were the result of me going insane because of what I had done. I knew my brain had created all these fake memories to shield me from the terrible realization that my life was over. I was in denial, my brain still trying to prevent me from coming to terms with the fact that I was going to wake up in the hospital and be informed of what my actions had caused. I knew I was going to jail for manslaughter. I was in the hospital because I had gone insane and was not yet fit to stand trial. That's why security was watching me so closely and wouldn't let me leave. That's why I was being restrained this whole time. Holy shit. At this point, I began hyperventilating uncontrollably. It felt like my heart stopped beating, and I was afraid I was going to pass out. This was the scariest moment I've ever had on drugs. Luckily, one of the nurses realized what I was thinking after I asked her how many people I killed and when I would remember. She assured me that nobody was hurt, thank God. I was led away from my dad and told to change into a hospital gown. This task seemed as complex as defusing a bomb. I want to point out that at this point, I wasn't hallucinating anymore. I was still in a state of complete mental confusion with no idea that I was actually in the hospital. I couldn't shake the logic that I was still at my house. For the next few hours in the hospital, I slowly gave up on trying to escape. I realized I wasn't going to get out because my mind was still playing tricks on me. There would be weird occurrences where I could predict exactly what the nurses would say and ask me periodically over the next few hours. My mind was so behind that I was living a staggered existence. In real life, a nurse would come in, hook up the IVs, ask me questions, and leave. For me, I wouldn't even be aware of when they actually came into the room. I would imagine it happening a few minutes after it actually did, which is why it played in loops in my head if I didn't cooperate. The event had already happened, so I was in an endless loop of refusing the Valium and Ativan that seemed to go on for hours when in reality I had already taken the pill and been given the shot. The point where I started to realize I had ended up in the hospital was around 7 at night. A doctor came in and explained that I was having a bad trip and would stay here until I calmed down enough to go home. I was still tripping so hard that I didn't believe I was in the hospital, but it began to dawn on me that maybe I was going to wake up in the hospital tomorrow. I was a day behind in my brain. I still had no sense of time and was surprised by how brief my visit to the hospital seemed. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open and stared at the wall. Uh, it seemed like 10 minutes later when the nurse came in with my parents and said it was midnight and I was free to go home. I apologized to my parents many times. My mom made a joke referencing my insane counting from 1 to 4 when she found me in my room. I looked at her in horror. Holy shit, that was real? I realized that everything I thought wasn't real after I left my room was completely real. I really fought my parents, tried to jump out of a car, said some really embarrassing things, removed my clothes, and made them sit in the hospital with me for hours. I felt terrible. I was worried this meant I'd never be able to take a psychedelic drug again. The day after the incident, I realized this ordeal gave me the utmost respect for hallucinogenic drugs and crushed my idea that I was immune to a bad trip. It can happen to anyone when they get out of their league. I had read plenty about people blacking out and reporting similar experiences while having no awareness of their actions in real life. I had dismissed this as something that would never happen to me. I stand here today admitting I was wrong. I assumed I could handle it, let alone handle it in front of my parents. I will never make this mistake again. If you've read this far, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this report. It's been about 2 months since this happened. Uh, I have taken the same tabs about 10 times since then, never taking more than 2. I won't take 3 again unless I'm completely sure I'll be alone for 12 or more hours. I probably would have been okay on 3 if my parents weren't home or if I had stayed at my friend's, but that wasn't the choice I made, and I should have realized that. And I wish everyone the best in their journeys.